Well, good morning. I'm glad you could join us on this first Sunday in August. There's an election coming up on Tuesday, and while primaries typically don't attract the same interest as general elections, there are some big decisions to be made this time. This morning we'll be talking with someone who has a special interest in this one. It starts right now.
From TV6, this is The Ryan Report. Here's your host, Don Ryan.
Well, when you go to the polls on Tuesday, you'll have a choice to vote in either the Democratic or Republican primary. You don't have to declare your party, but if you vote on both sides of the ballot, it won't count. I said at the top of the show that our guest this morning has a special interest in this election. We'll explain more about that as we talk with Matt Morgan, a Democrat who wants to represent Northern Michigan in Congress. Matt Morgan, welcome to the Ryan Report.
Thank you for having me.
Nice to have you with us. Typically, I like to get a little background on our guest before I start, but I think in your case, I want to start right off with the fact that this is kind of a special election for you. You were the only Democrat running for Congress as the election deadline appeared.
That's right.
But yet you're not on the ballot. So tell us what happened.
Well, we turned in our nominating petitions. You have to gather signatures, and we gathered a little over 1,500 nominating signatures from registered voters in every one of the 32 counties in the district. We turned those signatures in 2 months ahead of the deadline, but then 3 days after the filing deadline, we were told that the state would not be certifying our nominating petitions because of an error on the address for the candidate. Okay. So we fought that. We believed that the error was not significant enough to invalidate the votes or the signatures of more than 1,500 registered voters in Michigan. State of Michigan didn't agree, and so now we're having to run a write-in campaign as the only declared Democrat running for Congress.
So let's explain that too, because you do have an opportunity. The main thing, as far as you're concerned, I'm sure, is to get on the November ballot.
That's right.
And to do that, you're running this write-in campaign. Tell us about that.
Well, you make the point. To get on the November ballot, you have to win the primary. And so the way we're going to win the primary in this case now is as a write-in candidate. So when you go and if you vote Democrat in the primary on Tuesday, you'll go down the list of candidates, and when you get to U.S. Representative, there's just a blank and an empty circle there. So what I have to ask my voters to do is to go out and to write in Matt Morgan and fill in that bubble. So as the only declared candidate who's actually running a write-in campaign, we get a certain number of votes, get over that bar, win the primary, and get on the ballot in November.
And let's explain too that typically if you had two candidates running in a write-in, you would just have to get more votes than the other guy. But in this case, you have to meet a certain threshold. You want to, and I realize there's not a certain number, but do you want to try to explain
Well, it's a formula, and it's based, the missing variable in the formula is the number of voters that cast a vote for the top of the ticket. So the top of our ticket is essentially Senator Debbie Stabenow. I need about 1 in 20. One of every 20 voters who votes for Debbie Stabenow has to write my name in. And so we estimate that number to be around perhaps 3,000. And if it were a historic turnout year, it would be as much as 4,000. But we're very confident. We have so many great supporters here in this district. There's 32 counties in the congressional district, so getting up to 4,000 votes is something we're shooting well beyond that.
And for those voters, it's almost impossible to run a write-in campaign in the general election, because I think in the last election, the leader had about 200,000 votes, a little less than that.
Right.
So it's pretty hard to get that many.
That's why it's important that people understand that this isn't about the general election. I'm not a write-in candidate for the general election. I'm a write-in candidate for the nomination. And so when I win the primary and I become the Democratic nominee, then I automatically appear on that ballot in November.
So those voters who are Democrats who are concerned really have to show up and write in your name.
Absolutely, and we want them to come out and vote anyway. We have a gubernatorial primary, and we want folks to show up and vote for their candidate for governor. And so when we do that, we just have to educate them. And you made a really good point in the beginning, is a lot of voters need to understand or be reminded that you can't cross party lines or else they toss your ballot.
And this time, looking at the election, there are reasons for both Democrats and Republicans to show up. There's that gubernatorial primary. There's a 38th Senate seat on the Republican side.
Right.
There are just a lot of reasons, and you on the Democratic side in the congressional race. Let's give people a chance to get to know you. You say on your website you grew up in a working class family in rural Midwest. Tell us Tell us about that.
Yeah, so I'd like to make clear to folks, because I didn't grow up in Michigan. Don't pretend I did. I married into Michigan. My wife grew up in Lawrence and then went to high school in Kalkaska. Okay. So we have that strong connection to Michigan, and always knew that we were going to come back here. But you know, one of the reasons I think Angie and I kind of connected in the Marine Corps was because we grew up in very similar places. I grew up in a farming community in East Central Illinois. We lived about 5 miles outside of town. The town that I went to high school in was about 2,000 people in that town, so very small high school, about 60 kids in my graduating class. And it was a farming community. So most of the kids that I went to school with, their families were either farmers or they worked in the coal mines or on the railroad, because the railroad passed through that town as well. And
Your website also talked about detasseling corn and walking beans.
First job I ever had was walking beans. So the major crops in East Central Illinois are soybeans and corn, seed corn primarily. And so walking beans is when you go out, you just walk through the soybean fields with a hoe or a hook, and you cut out the black nightshade and the buttonweed and the type of stuff that will essentially gum up a combine and ruin a yield, for soybeans. And then detasseling is a process where, within seed corn, they're working to cross-pollinate the seed corn. So you go through, and there's certain rows where you remove the tassels from the corn so that they can make the cross-pollination work.
Okay. You graduated from the University of Illinois, and then you went into the Marine Corps. And
That's right.
Was that your plan in the beginning, to become a Marine?
I had wanted to be a Marine since I was in junior high. It was something that I always been looking toward as a goal. I was given the opportunity through a Naval ROTC scholarship to go to the University of Illinois and become a Marine officer. So it's really all I wanted to do with my life from really the earliest age.
Tell us about your Marine Corps service. What did that involve?
I was commissioned in 1993, and I became an infantry officer. So my first job was I was in Southern California, and I was a light armored reconnaissance platoon commander. It was amazing fun. If I could have stayed a 23-year-old lieutenant my entire career, I would have done that. But moving on from there, after I did an overseas deployment there, I came back and retrained as a public affairs officer. So I worked as a spokesperson for many years and a communication planner. That took me a lot of places. After 9/11, I went back to the East Coast to join an anti-terrorism unit at Camp Lejeune, North Carolina. And then from there, I deployed to Iraq for the invasion in 2003, spent the rest of 2003 in the Horn of Africa supporting counterterrorism operations there. And then following that, I got my graduate degree and went to work in the Pentagon. I worked in the Pentagon for several years, actually took kind of a leave of absence from the Pentagon to go back to Iraq for a year in 2007, 2008. And then finished up after I came back and worked for Secretary Gates, was in the Pentagon during the transition from the Bush to the Obama administrations. And then from there I went to a major force command in Norfolk, Virginia.
We'll talk about some more of your background in just a couple of minutes. Back with more on the Ryan Report after we take this 2-minute break. We're talking with Matt Morgan, who is a candidate for Congress, running in the primary to become a Democratic candidate, running a write-in campaign. We were talking about your background in the Marines. Before we leave that, so if you do get this nomination, it will be Marine against Marine. What does that mean?
Well, it's something that's unique. I don't know that it's ever happened before. We haven't seen it before. But we've got really, I think, a new generation of veterans now that sees the world differently. Congressman Bergman and I know we have very different views on how we approach several issues, including national security, budget responsibility, those types of things. So I think that we're going to be able to distinguish ourselves most certainly on the issue.
What led to your decision to run for a seat in Congress from this district?
I always believe that leadership is about service. I mean, that's what we learn in the Marine Corps, is that you serve the people you lead. And, coming out of the elections in 2016, and when we saw this Congress take the floor, became more and more concerned that what we're seeing coming out of Washington isn't real leadership. I mean, we should be taking our values to Washington and not bringing Washington values back to Michigan. We got more to teach them than they have to teach us, I think. And so, focusing on representing, really truly representing the values of your district is something that I thought was important. And so my wife and I decided that this was time to go back to seek public service in a different way, albeit not in uniform.
And you talked about, you say, I know there are many citizens who want politicians to have the courage to set aside partisan politics, but really Washington has become kind of legislation by party caucus. How do you work around that?
I'm very enthusiastic about the young generation of veterans that we have in the House right now and running campaigns. And I firmly believe, I have a friend that I shared an office with in Baghdad in 2007. And he's currently the Republican congressman from Nebraska's 2nd District. And I have every bit of confidence that I could walk into his office and sit down and we could talk about the issues, we could work through things, and not necessarily be held hostage by the caucus.
Okay. You talked about issues. Let's talk about issues. What do you think are the key issues in this campaign? And you started to mention some. But
I think it's affordable access to health care is one of the most critical issues. I hear it all the time from every voter. And it doesn't matter if whether you're on Medicare and you're concerned about your copays and the drug prices, whether you qualify for Medicaid expansion under the Healthy Michigan Plan, or your kids are covered under Medicaid and you're concerned about the future of the funding for the program, or if you have a good job and you have good health insurance, but your premiums are just going up and becoming unaffordable to the point where, some families, I know my neighbor who's a dentist with 5 children, he's paying upwards of $80,000 in premiums every year for his health insurance. I think that's really critically important. What was done, what Congressman Bergman voted for 3 times in the Affordable Health Care Act was essentially a bill that would have crushed Medicaid in this district, and under a Healthy Michigan Plan, that covers more than 46,000 people just in Michigan's 1st Congressional District alone. It also would have crippled rural hospitals. And we know that in this district with more than 20 hospitals, many of those would have been forced to close. And it's in places like Newberry and the one up in Calumet as well, the Aspirus Hospital in Keweenaw. Those hospitals would be really put in a bad position financially if that health care bill had passed. So we really have to work very hard to fix the issue of affordable access to health care.
there are some Democrats who say that Medicare should be extended to all, or that we should have a true national health care plan. Do you support that idea?
I believe that Medicare expansion is the best approach right now. I think there's a lot of things that have to be fixed, though. Many people are not happy with aspects of Medicare, and so if we were going to expand it, we'd have to make sure we were fixing those issues as well. But I'm open to other solutions. It doesn't have to be my solution or the highway. I want to work together because we know that we're going to need both parties to work together to support this. That's going to require fixing insurance, health insurance regulation, and drug prices, and that's a key. Neither of those two things were addressed in the Affordable Care Act, and we have to make sure we're addressing those if we want to really truly fix this problem.
We just have time to begin to explore this before a break, but let's talk a little bit about jobs and the economy, because they're certainly very big. Now, Republicans would say that they've done a good job. The employment rate is at its lowest in many years. What are your thoughts on economic issues?
There's no question that we're at in a period of historic employment, full employment. We're in the 10th year of a 10-year expansion. So the last 19 months has continued that trend. It didn't start that trend. So we're in the 10th year of that expansion. It's good to see jobless numbers low. The biggest problem we have right now is wage growth. And we're just not seeing wages even keep up with inflation, and particularly not the cost of living. Anyone who's watching right now can think about what $200 worth of groceries looked like in their grocery cart 2 years ago. And now think about today what $200 worth of groceries will get you. It doesn't fill that cart anymore. And if a family is taking home more money, great, but the cost of living is going up, and so it's a net loss. So we have to work really hard on wage growth, and what the Republicans' plan has done so far is not addressing that.
Okay, we'll pick it up right there in just a couple of minutes. Back with more on the Ryan Report after we take this break. Again, today we're talking with Matt Morgan, who's a Democratic candidate for Congress. We were talking about jobs. Historically, the Upper Peninsula, especially part of this district, has relied on the natural resource industries. Do you support those ideas?
Absolutely, we support that. We have these incredible natural resources up here, and particularly when it comes to mining, we have to be looking at ways that we can do that responsibly and keep, maintain full employment, grow it if necessary. Everybody's got a cell phone, and every cell phone has, copper and nickel in it, and we have those resources. And beyond that, the future of the paper industry, I think, is really exciting because with the movement away from plastics, disposable plastics, there are a lot of really exciting cellulose products that are coming out, cellulose-based plastics rather than petroleum-based plastics. I think the opportunity to explore that and grow that is something we absolutely have to keep looking at. And really the health of our federal and state forests rely on, responsibly timbering those resources as well.
If you talk to many employers today, large and small, one of their big concerns is finding qualified employees. And clearly we have to do more to train employees of the future. What are your thoughts on that issue?
I hear that everywhere I go. Business owners, whether you're in manufacturing or you're just a small business providing a service in the local community, finding skilled labor there's a critical shortage here, and a lot of that has to do with the fact that the way we've handled education over the last 25 years. We absolutely have to do a better job of preparing individuals and giving them the skill sets that they need to be able to succeed. In Michigan's 1st District, for every one job that we create that requires a 4-year degree or graduate degree, we're creating more than 10 jobs that require an associate's degree or some kind of technical certificate, whether that's a series of welding certificates like that. We have to approach this more seriously, and I think the federal government needs to be a much better partner in career technical education, particularly in some of the rural community school districts I know. There are areas where, in the Traverse Bay area, for example, where their career tech education program is very well funded because they have a tax base that can support it. But if you get up into the Copper Country, and Copper Country ISD just passed a $1 million to support their career tech program last August. That's going to provide $1.3 million, I believe it is, annually to support their career tech program. It's not enough. They can pay tuition, they can bus their kids to the program, but there's not enough left for capital investment, and that's where I think the federal government could be a better partner.
Time does not allow us to discuss all the issues that will be in this campaign, but what about the military? That's part of your background as well. Are we on the right track with what we're doing with the U.S. military? Well,
we've got to absolutely fund our military, and one of the biggest things that they're facing right now is what we call reset and modernize, and that's the challenge of saying we got to take all the equipment that we wore out because we wore it out before its service life was over, because we used it at a rate that was not intended because of our commitments overseas, and then in terms of modernizing, of course, the equipment, making sure that our troops have the best equipment we can possibly provide them. I am concerned, however, that we're continuing to deploy troops around the world. Our sons and daughters are going overseas today under an authorization that was passed in October of 2001. Congress has an obligation to make sure that they are in front of the decision to authorize the deployment of troops overseas, because that's our blood and treasure. And if Congress is not in front of that, then you and I and the voters don't have a say in it. And so Congress really has to step forward, should have stepped forward years ago, to repeal the authorization to use for military force that was passed in 2001, so that we can get the voters back in front of the decisions about where we send our kids.
We have only a couple of minutes left. What about the veterans? We hear a lot about veterans not getting the services they need.
Yeah, 1 in 10 voters in this congressional district is a veteran. A lot of that has to do with the fact that folks that served want to come home. It also has to do with the fact that we had these large air bases here, so we got a lot of Cold War Air Force veterans in the area. Getting access to health care is no less an issue for any of them than it is any other citizen, and particularly when we force those folks to go to a veterans facility. You're depending on where you are in this congressional district, that means either driving to Iron Mountain or to Saginaw. And so we need to make care more accessible to them. I don't support privatizing health care in the VA. What I do support is making sure that our veterans can go be taken care of in facilities just like anyone would if they were on Medicaid or Medicare.
Okay. We have less than a minute left. I guess I'll give you one more opportunity to tell voters what you'd like them to do, since you have a somewhat unusual situation on this campaign.
Yeah, when you go vote Tuesday, and we need people to vote because we have really important primary elections out there for state senate, for the gubernatorial race, and so we want voters to get out and vote. What we need them to do is when you vote Democrat in that center column and you get down to representative, there's a blank space. You just have to write Matt Morgan, simple as that, and then darken that bubble to make their vote count.
M-A-T-T-M-O-R-G-A-N.
You got it.
Okay. Well, thanks very much for coming in and talking to us. It's going to be interesting to see what happens in the primary and as the general election comes around.
Well, we're looking forward to being the Democratic nominee as of next Tuesday.
Okay, thanks. I'll be back with some other thoughts on Michigan's congressional district in the UP in just a couple of minutes. Well, Michigan's 1st congressional district covers over 40% of the state, including all the Upper Peninsula and 16 counties and part of another one below the bridge. Today, the one-man, one-vote law is very strictly applied when the district boundaries are drawn. But that didn't seem to be the case back in the 1950s. I say that because at that time, there were 2 districts in the UP. The Western and Central UP was then in the 12th district and represented by Republican John Bennett for about 20 years. I actually had the pleasure of interviewing Bennett in my radio days as a young man when he appeared as a guest on the morning interview show I did from the coffee shop at the J.J. Newberry store in Ishpeming. It's a long way from Capitol Hill to that coffee shop for an appearance on a little 250-watt radio station, but he came, and I have to say he took it seriously. A Republican named Victor Knox represented the 11th district, which included the Eastern UP, until he was defeated in 1964 by a Chicago-born attorney named Raymond Clevenger, who had a legal practice in Sault Ste. Marie and was active in Democratic politics. He won the right to represent the then expanded 11th District, which stretched from Ironwood to Sault Ste. Marie and down to Alpena, making it one of the largest in the eastern United States. Various reasons are given for Clevenger's victory, including his support for the establishment of the Pictured Rocks National Park. But most experts believe he was swept to victory in the Democratic landslide that saw Lyndon Johnson soundly defeat Barry Goldwater in the race for president. If you go back over 100 years, Clevenger was one of only 3 Democrats to represent this district during that time. The others were Frank Hook in the 1930s and 40s and Bart Stupak from 1993 through 2010. Hook and Stupak were long-serving, but Clevenger's tenure was very short. He was defeated after only 1 term by Republican Phil Ruby. You know, as I started to write this, I thought I knew the history pretty well, since I had worked for Congressman Ruby as his district representative in the 1970s. But then I discovered the story of William Josiah McDonald. The Wisconsin-born McDonald served as prosecuting attorney for Keweenaw County and later Houghton County, and in 1912 he ran for Congress representing the Progressive Party against incumbent Republican H. Olin Young. Although the unofficial return showed that McDonald had won the seat, some votes were not included in the official count due to a mistake in how McDonald's name appeared on the ballot in Ontonagon County. So Young, the Republican, was awarded the seat. But he resigned a couple of months later when the House Committee on Elections awarded the seat to McDonald. His tenure was short as he lost in the next election to Republican W. Frank James. Well, now you know as much about congressmen from this district as I know, and perhaps more than you wanted to know. One thing about history, it's written every day. The next chapter in this story will be written on November 7th. You have a part to play in that, so put it on your calendar. I'll be back in a minute. Before we wrap it up for today, a couple of reminders. First, keep Upper Michigan's source in mind for the latest news anytime. You can also check out the Ryan Report at that same address. And our second reminder is to make sure you get out and vote put that on your calendar for Tuesday. As I said earlier, both Republicans and Democrats have good reason to get out to the polls on this election day. Thanks to Matt Morgan for joining us this morning. He's one of the reasons Democrats have to go out to the polls on Tuesday. And thank you for joining us. I hope we can get together again at the same time next Sunday morning.